Dear friends, welcome to a new episode of our podcast. Today, we tackle one of the most challenging topics for a Christian, a topic I am sure all of us have pondered more than once. I am talking about suffering, especially suffering that seems unjustified. How many times have we faced pain and suffering that seem inexplicable? We've asked ourselves, God, why do you allow this? When pain strikes us, when we see our loved ones suffer, or when we confront the world's tragedies, it is natural for doubts to arise. The very existence of suffering in the world is one of the reasons many atheists challenge the idea of God's existence, questioning how a good God could permit such widespread and unjustified suffering. How can he remain unmoved by the immense tragedies that strike the world, or fail to help a mother pleading for the salvation of her little child? These doubts are not something to fear. They are not questions we should run away from, but are an essential part of our faith. Today, I want to invite you to reflect together on a profound and difficult question. Is God's will behind our suffering? I don't want to give you simple or superficial answers, but rather walk with you through the scriptures and our faith, sharing the questions and seeking together to find meaning. Because faith doesn't provide all the answers, but it offers guidance, a light that can help us find hope even in the darkness. Suffering is a reality that none of us can avoid. From the moment we are born, we are exposed to various kinds of suffering, physical, emotional, spiritual. And when these painful experiences hit us, it is normal to wonder if it all has a meaning, if there is a divine plan behind it all. The Bible, the book of our faith, does not ignore pain. On the contrary, it confronts it head-on and invites us to reflect on it. Let's start with a fundamental truth. God is love. The first letter of John clearly states, "Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." If God is love, how can we reconcile this with the reality of suffering? This is the question that has troubled believers for centuries. Job, one of the oldest books in the Bible, tells the story of a righteous man who suffers a series of devastating calamities. Job loses everything, his family, his wealth, his health, and he wonders why God allows such a thing. Despite his questions and protests, Job never receives a clear answer from God about the reason for his suffering. However, in the end, Job understands one important thing: the greatness of God and our limited understanding. At the end of the book, Job acknowledges, "I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." This teaches us that even if we do not always understand the why of suffering, we can still trust in God and His love. Another key aspect to consider is human freedom. God created us free, and this freedom comes with consequences. Humanity chose to rebel against God, and this rebellion brought sin into the world. Sin is not just a bad action, but a condition that has tainted all of creation. Because of sin, death, suffering, and disease have entered the world more forcefully. But be careful. We should not think that every suffering is a direct punishment for a personal sin. Jesus himself challenged this idea. In the Gospel of John, we read about a man born blind. Jesus' disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus replied, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." With this response, Jesus teaches us that suffering is not always directly linked to a personal sin. Sometimes suffering can be an opportunity for the manifestation of God's glory. So, does this mean that God tests us by inflicting suffering? No, it is true that God allows suffering, but He is not the author of it. This is an important distinction. God created a good world, but He also gave man the freedom to choose. And with that freedom, humanity chose to distance itself from God, bringing sin and suffering into the world. However, God has not abandoned us. He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to redeem us and give us hope that goes beyond this life. The cross of Christ is the center of our faith. It is a symbol of suffering, but also of hope and redemption. Jesus, the Son of God, chose to suffer and die on a cross. This is not just a historical event, but the cornerstone of God's plan for the salvation of humanity. The cross shows us God's love in a profound and radical way. As the Apostle Paul says, Christ loved me and gave Himself for me. But it is not just Christ's suffering that saves us. It is His love that manifests through that suffering. This is important. The cross is not the end of the story. After the cross, there is the resurrection. Jesus did not stay in the tomb. He rose, defeated death, and opened the way to eternal life for us. This is our hope. St. Paul explains it clearly. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Without the resurrection, everything we believe in falls apart. But Christ is risen, and this is the proof that death does not have the last word. Another aspect of suffering that we often overlook is that it reminds us of our mortality. We live in a world that often tries to hide the reality of death. We distract ourselves with work, entertainment, and daily concerns, forgetting that our earthly life has an end. But suffering, especially sudden and inexplicable suffering, forces us to confront this truth. Jesus, in His teaching, never told us to ignore death. On the contrary, He warned us, "Be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect Him." This reminds us that our life is short and that we must live it with awareness. Suffering, as painful as it is, can be a way in which God calls us to reflect on what is truly important: our relationship with Him and the eternal destiny of our soul. An atheist philosopher, Bertrand Russell, once said that it was impossible to believe in a loving God when witnessing the suffering of a dying child. Russell saw suffering as an argument against the existence of God. But a Christian pastor, who had spent much of his life alongside dying children, responded to him with a question, "And you, what do you have to offer these children?" Despite all his wisdom, Russell could offer nothing but a cold and desperate, "I'm sorry, but it all ends here." But we Christians have a different answer. We believe that even in the deepest pain, there is a hope that goes beyond death. We believe that suffering is not the last word, and that the resurrection of Christ opens the door to a new life, an eternal life with God. The great truth we often forget is that God did not remain indifferent to human suffering. He did something extraordinary. He entered our world, became flesh in Jesus Christ, and lived our suffering. He knew pain, fatigue, fear, and death, and He did it for us. This is what the gospel teaches us. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is not just an act of suffering, but an act of infinite love. Through His death and resurrection, Jesus defeated the power of sin and death. He opened the way to eternal life for us. And this means that even if we suffer, even if we die, we have the hope of a new life with God. As St. Paul says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Today's sufferings, as terrible as they are temporary. The glory that awaits us is eternal. We live in a world that often tries to hide the reality of death. Modern culture pushes us to live as if we were immortal, as if earthly life were all that matters. But suffering and death are part of our human condition, and ignoring them does not make them disappear. On the contrary, it makes us less prepared to face them when they come. Jesus taught us to live with an awareness of our mortality, not to scare us, but to help us put our life into perspective. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. These words invite us to reflect on what is truly important: our relationship with God and the eternal destiny of our soul. Remembering that our earthly life has an end helps us live each day with gratitude and faith. Suffering, as painful as it is, can be a reminder of this reality. It can help us remember that life is short and precious, and that we must live with awareness and hope. The hope that the gospel offers us is not an escape from reality, but a deeper and more complete vision of reality. Death is not the end, but a passage to true life, eternal life with God. When someone questions the existence of God because of the suffering in the world, we must respond that it is precisely suffering that demonstrates the existence of God. Because if God did not exist, if Jesus had not shown us through the resurrection that earthly experience is brief and fleeting, what would remain of us? What sense would our pain have? What sense would our joy, love, hopes, and lives have if we could not redeem all this at the end of our existence? It is death, suffering, and life itself that demonstrate that Jesus' promise of eternal life is the only answer that makes sense to the difficulties of our lives. Dear brothers and sisters, suffering is an inevitable part of our lives, but we do not have to face it alone. God is with us, even in the most difficult moments. Through suffering, we can draw closer to Him, find deeper meaning, and hope that goes beyond this life. Our earthly life has an end, but our faith gives us the certainty of eternal life with God. I invite you to reflect on these words and to share your thoughts in the comments. How do you deal with suffering in your life? How does your faith in the resurrection help you? Subscribe to the channel to continue walking together in our journey of faith and prayer. We are a community, and together we can find strength and comfort in the Lord. May God bless you and give you peace, even in the darkest moments.